Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. This week, the Ridge Students Director Shelby Bierwagen joined Nate and I to talk about the question, what do your kids wish you knew? Shelby asked that to a bunch of students, got some really interesting answers that we think will be really helpful for you. So here's our conversation with Shelby. Hi, Shelby. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining Nate and I.
Yeah. Hey, guys. Excited to be back.
Pumped to have you, Shelby.
So, okay, let me start off with a fun question. All right. A few weeks ago, Mark did in his message, he recited different common slang words, like teenage slang. And I was really curious because I know that's Mark's interpretation of that. I was curious, in your experience interacting with students, what is your favorite student slang word?
Oh, yes. All of my students were very proud and disappointed in Mark for doing that at the same time. Yeah, so I was thinking about this. My favorite one is kind of old. I don't know if students still say it, but my favorite is definitely extra.
Okay.
Extra, which is over the top, excessive, dramatic, all the things.
That's amazing. Nate, I'm curious. You've done lessons and stuff like that. As you've been interacting with students, have you heard a slang word that you're like, what?
I don't really use it, but
Nice preface.
yeah. And I don't know how old this one is now, but bussin'.
Bus. Oh, man.
If you say something like that around Mark, he'll just have no clue what you're saying.
One of my can you explain what bussin' means?
I think it's just awesome, right, Shelby? It's just like when something's straight bussin'.
Close enough, Nate.
Oh, do we need to get a phone a friend on this podcast where we just dial up?
I'm gonna get in trouble.
Yeah.
All the millennials talking about teenage slang.
Well, my favorite one that I've heard is and it's to me it's funny because it's just so ridiculous. But eat. Eat.
Yes.
That's a good one, yeah. Because
they'll just shout it at some ridiculous moment or kind of throwing caution to the wind, you know? And it's where did that even, it's somebody just made sound effects. You can kind of trace the origin of these things, sip tea. Okay. Something like that, where it's okay, you can kind of get out the meaning of it, but eat anyway.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty good.
It's hilarious. It slays. There we go. There's another one.
There you go.
All right, I'm done. I'm done with popping those words.
Let's just do this the whole episode.
Yeah, right. Listenership died at minute 4. No.
Shelby, teach us.
Yeah.
I felt so out of place this weekend. So it's homecoming. So the students are showing me all the pictures, and it's pretty much a whole new language of them just talking about their outfits. Snatched, lit, fire, drip. I'm I have no idea what you're saying, but I am here for
it. Drip is a very funny one because to me, I hear the word drip and I think something very negative, like a drippy nose or a drippy faucet. And yet drip is oh, that is nice, you know? And so that's funny to hear it positively said. You sucked us back in with these, Shelby. How could you do that to us? Anyway, let's transition. Okay, so our topic today, hey, what do your kids wish you knew? So Shelby, talking with students, interacting with students, what are some things that maybe you've even talked to them and asked them about this? What are a few things that students really wish their parents knew?
Yes, as I was prepping for this podcast, I had a million different ideas just between conversations I've had with students. I follow all of the big organizations that'll do studies where they can ask students. And Then I just had a moment. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to straight up ask our students.
Yeah.
So I said all of our high school is just a survey, anonymous one. I was like, guys, completely anonymous. What do you wish adults knew? And it was pretty fascinating because a lot of trends came out in their responses. One of them that came out a lot was this idea of them how they're not trying to be dramatic. I had, here's what two of them said. One of them said, like, I wish that adults understood that we feel just as much as them. We aren't being dramatic just because we're teenagers. We're expressing what we feel. Another one that said, like, our feelings are valid too. I'm like, oh, that just hit me that they felt the need to say that. Like, we're not being dramatic just because we're teenagers. The things we go through and struggle with are just as hard as the things they do. There's this level of, well, I went through it too, and you're just being dramatic that the adults have. Like, ugh.
That's so tough. I can't imagine too, just being their youth pastor, like, some of those conversations when they come to you and bring those things that they feel like they can't speak to their parents about, how that must be just hard from a leadership standpoint as well.
Yeah, when I hear them saying these things, I feel for them because I think there's so many different developmental reasons and all of these things that could explain why adults might see teenagers as dramatic. There's all the emotional regulation skills they're learning, parts of the brain and how they function. But like at the end of the day, when I hear students talking about this, honestly, my gut reaction is like, so what if they're being dramatic? So what if we think they're being dramatic because that's what they are feeling right now? I mean, even as adults, like how annoyed do we get when someone is trying to say that what we're feeling is invalid? Like we hear so much about gaslighting, all of these things. I'm like, we literally are doing this to our teenagers when we say they're being dramatic.
Well, and I wonder if it comes from a place of, it's like of expectation, like you think of, hey, you expect someone to react a certain way or in a certain method. And I want to preface real quick, like these conversations don't come from a place of hating on parents, because we know that the job of being a parent is incredibly challenging and difficult. It's from a place of, hey, what types of things can we do to really equip adults, parents, to be able to interact and hear the things that maybe a teenager wouldn't feel comfortable saying, or just be able to give you a tool to be like, okay, maybe I can interact with my teenager in this way. So with that kind of concept in mind, if it is that type of scenario where, maybe you feel as though your student or a teenager you're mentoring or something like that is being dramatic, what do you think the response is for yourself in that moment, Shelby, like emotionally, and how do you see past that?
Yeah, I think that's such a tricky thing. No matter what the age is, whether it's a toddler having a meltdown or a teenager talking about these things, checking our own emotions and our response is difficult. But I think it's one of the most important things, because so often when we're listening, especially to our teenagers, but listening to anybody, we're listening so that we can respond rather than just listening to them to understand. And I think a lot of times when teenagers are talking about this thing, they're processing out loud. So if we're hearing drama, it's literally them just trying to let their emotions out so they can figure out what's feeling themselves sometimes. Sometimes in that moment, they'll even realize like, oh, maybe I am overreacting. Or maybe they'll realize, wait, this actually is a bigger deal than I thought it was. But they just need someone to listen just to listen so that they can talk about what's going on.
I know sometimes like speaking with teenagers really feels like you're speaking to like an alien or something, or just like some totally different creature, right? And especially as someone who is not a parent, and certainly not a parent of teenagers, I have students, like John mentioned, I do lessons, or like even just students at church that I've just connected with. And like different students have totally different home situations, right? And like totally different parents. But it seems like there is this universal thing of like them being like, oh, I don't want to talk to mom and dad about that. Yet it's interesting to hear this yearning for being heard and expressing themselves and stuff. And so like, I wonder if you just even have any tips of like, man, how do you speak teenager? You know, like how do you get to their level and even get to that place where, you know, where you can kind of like open up with them?
Yeah. Honestly, the biggest thing behind that is time, really. It's earning their trust over a course of time. Because something I found a lot is that students might respond with something intentionally dramatic, or they might be over the top on purpose to see how you're going to respond. They want to see, how are you going to react? Are you actually going to listen to me? Or are you going to write this off? Like, let me kind of drop something that's not super important necessarily, just to see how you respond before I actually ask you the real question I want to talk to you about. So it takes time of building this history, this trust with them of, oh, you do listen to me. You actually want to understand. You're not just listening to it so that you can try to tell me exactly what to do, but you really want to understand what's going on in my life and just hear it because you care about me versus just trying to fix my problems or tell me what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, that's good.
It sounds like it's about creating a space in conversation where they feel comfortable to share. Because even like Nate saying, or we talked about at the beginning, where it's like, you might not have the right words. You might not be able to speak, quote, the language, right? But you can speak the language of listening, which is, you know, where you're asking a question and then just not reacting harshly. Or I think like you said, Shelby, where you're not reacting with an instant answer. Even though it might be very clear to you, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, I feel like I have a very good piece of advice for you to take. Which I mean is all of our Achilles heel, right? We love to give advice, but truly listening first.
And we've done something else I hear a lot of our teenagers say is they know for the most part that the adults in their lives really do want the best for them. They know it, even if they know their response might not feel like it.
Yeah.
They do. And they say it to me. They say that they know their parents, they know how much they just want to help them. But sometimes our urge to just fix their problems or our urge to protect them so they don't have to go through the hard stuff is almost counterproductive. So a lot of times they'll tell me like these, whether usually in relationships, that's where I hear a lot about, like they'll just need to vent to me about how their parents are responding to their dating life. And they'll say it themselves. I don't have to prompt them to say this of, I know they're trying to protect me. They're trying to make sure I don't get hurt, but I need to do it. I need to learn for myself and I want to experience it myself, which I feel this tension with them of, they want to be able to tell their parents how much it means to them that they're trying to protect them, and they want to help them learn, and they want to give them the best advice because they want what's best for them. But then also trying to balance, it's my life and I want to make these mistakes so that I actually learn it and don't just know it.
Do you think that like intimidation that adults feel about like talking to teenagers sometimes is like silly? Like, I think sometimes like you see a group of teenagers and, you know, especially depending on how much you've hung out with teenagers and students, and certainly maybe your age or like what you thought of yourself when you're a teenager, you might think like, oh, they don't think I'm cool at all, you know, or like they don't want to talk to me. Like, do we get in our own way with trying to connect to them, right?
Yeah, we do. Yes. Honestly, like I get that all the time. They're like, how can I connect with teenagers? How can I connect with my student? Like, I'm not cool anymore. For this generation, especially, authenticity is the new cool. Like, you can just be real with them instead of trying to put on the, I'm the adult and I have it all put together face. Like, be real, especially when you can share the things you're struggling with too. or if you can relate with them about what they're talking about. Obviously, it's going to look different in your life than it does in a teenager's life. But a lot of those basic things that we all struggle with are the exact same, whether you're a teenager or an adult, which can create this really cool connection.
You mentioned like authenticity. Does that like mean you're not trying to fake essentially like the word this well. You don't want to fake this knowledge of what you're talking about. Instead, it'd actually be more beneficial to like humbly come to the table and be like, you know what, I have no idea, but tell me about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know is one of the best answers they can hear on so many things. Like, it's okay to say, I don't know. I think they see so many examples of people trying to be so put together that they can read through when you're making up an answer. They can see immediately if you don't know what you're talking about. Or the biggest thing I see so many of them talk about is how they'll hear adults talking about things. They'll talk about what's important, what they value, but they don't see them living it out in their own life. So even when a teenager hears you talking about something, until they see you doing it yourself or living it yourself, they almost don't trust it, or they just straight up don't. Which honestly is a timeless truth anyways. We know our actions speak louder than words.
So curious, are there some other things that you're talking with students that they share with you, you know, oh, I wish my parent or an adult knew this?
This one's kind of heavy, but I think it's a big deal. As one of the students I asked when they said, I wish that they would understand that I'm not and never will be the perfect child they expect me to be. And I hear that all the time from students because there's so much pressure on this generation. I mean, like, I could give you statistic after statistic that prove that this is the most stressed and anxious generation of teenagers that we have ever seen. And I see that all the time. Like, it's bigger than just the statistics. The pressure they're feeling to maintain their grades, to do all these extracurriculars, to have a job, and like just this long list of things they feel like they have to do. Just all these expectations that are coming. And then sometimes they get home and they're still feeling those pressures. They don't necessarily feel like when they get home, they can just kind of release and be themselves. They're nervous that they still need to maintain all of those high expectations, even around their family.
And certainly like some of the stuff that they've been dealing with, right? Like, it has been an insane few years, not to mention just like growing up with access to anything, basically. Like, it sort of raises the bar in a way that's not great, or like at least gives you that perception of the bar being raised. Like, why can't you do this? And, you know, like even for us, like I remember getting a cell phone that was pretty simple, right? But like I can't even fathom like being a child and just like everybody having an iPhone and stuff like that. And like I'm overwhelmed already with like social media and like everything that we have access to and stuff. It's like I can't imagine that just always being your existence, right?
There's definitely a different level of social pressure in their reality when you know that literally anything you say or do could be caught in a picture or on video and can be shown to anybody instantly.
Right. Man.
Which of course has its beautiful sides of them being able to connect and learn and all the things. But I think sometimes we forget about how that pressure is just kind of constantly in the background for them. There's this almost performance anxiety of anytime I'm around people, what I do matters more than maybe when I'm by myself, because anybody could see it. Anybody could hear it.
So I wonder, because I think you asked any parent and they would tell you they are well aware that their child is not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't
Yes.
think the reality is that they expect their child to be perfect, right? Like, I don't think any parent would say that they have that expectations. And yet, somewhere along the way, like, there's been a mistranslation, there's been a miscommunication, there's been a breakdown, because if that's the sense and the pressure that students are feeling, that means something's being conveyed incorrectly. So what do you think a parent can do to kind of rewrite that? And like, I mean, there's two things, right? There's the things we don't communicate and the things we start communicating. So I wonder if you could share maybe some of those things.
Honestly, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is creating this culture of connecting with your student, of having ongoing conversations. Because I think in a world where we are always so busy and running to the next thing all the time, sometimes we don't necessarily sit down to talk with our kids, and even just with other adults too. I think we all do this. We don't necessarily sit down to talk until there's a problem. So, when there are gaps in a class, then to triage the situation and talk about it. And maybe then the conversations about the social anxiety or the pressures they're feeling, all that might come up in that moment. But then the minute the grade gets brought up, it might seem like the problem's been resolved and the conversation doesn't necessarily continue. And that's not intentional. I think we just get so busy and we have so many things going on that we mean to get back to the conversation. I know parents, you mean to follow up with your kid, like, okay, they're stressed out, I want to talk about this. But there's also this, and this thing happening. I didn't realize it's been a month since we'd reconnected on this subject. One thing I've seen from several families that just seems to work so well is honestly scheduling it, which sounds counterintuitive because then you're just adding another thing to the list to do. But scheduling time to connect and make it regular enough that maybe sometimes you don't have things to talk about. Maybe you have to make up a conversation, you're having a goofy conversation. But when there's this, there's going to be time to talk about. You're going to have your once a week custard date or whatever it is you set up. Knowing that time is coming lets you prepare to have those conversations. So there's always this time that I can talk about things. I don't have to wait until I mess up and then we've made time to talk about it again. Or I don't have that anxiety of, I really want to talk to my parent about something, but I'm nervous to ask them to start a conversation.
Side note, we're in Wisconsin when you just nonchalantly throw the once a week custard date in there. Shelby, that is such good stuff. Like, it makes me think about all those parents that really are trying and like maybe could really use that encouragement from, you are the expert, right? And like you mentioned like times where maybe there's nothing to talk about, and like I just imagine there's a lot of parents that probably try and feel like they're failing, but like how would you encourage them? Like, certainly that's not wasted time, right? Like, certainly that's not a waste investment.
Absolutely not. Like, I think one of the biggest piece of encouragement I can give to parents is that your kids know you're trying. Over and over again, I just hear kids saying how they appreciate the things their parents have done. They might not feel comfortable telling you because they might be nervous and they might be honestly a little embarrassed to be like, hey, I love you. Thank you for this. That might feel awkward, but they do notice. They notice the time you put in. They notice when you've spent literally the entire weekend driving them from this event to this event. And they realize when you remember things, even though you're like addict. I get to hear the stories all the time, just these little snippets here and there, like, hey, my mom did this weekend, or my dad remembered this. But they might forget to come and tell you afterwards. So just be encouraged that they are talking about it. It's one of the coolest things about our small group leaders here and my role here is we get to hear them talk about what's going on in their lives. And that includes the really cool stuff, like the amazing things they love about their families, even if they don't tell you.
So I'm kind of picking up on a theme that there's like lots of things that it might be awkward for a student to bring up. Um, is there power in a parent being willing to bring up those awkward things and just kind of like naming something for what it is? Like, for example, back to the pressure thing, right? Would there be a lot of like freedom and comfort if a parent is like, "Hey, tell me about where you're feeling pressure right now. Are you feeling pressured? How is that going?" Where it's like you are almost giving like a shared vocabulary for how to process through some of that stuff.
Absolutely. It's kind of starting the conversation for them. Because I mean, it can be intimidating to bring up the things you're struggling with. Even as an adult, how often do we just kind of hide that we're struggling with things and we don't want to talk about it?
Yeah.
It's the same for our teenagers. So yeah, John, I think that's a great idea. Just calling it out. Be like, hey, just asking those questions. Is there an area where you're feeling pressure right now?
Mm.
Where do you feel you're struggling? Is there a spot where you feel like you're not living up to what you want to be doing? But then also being vulnerable for sure. Obviously an age appropriate way, but where are you as an adult struggling to? Be like, hey, you know what? I'm struggling to fit in with my coworkers too. Or, I'm feeling a lot of pressure at work because I feel like I don't have time to get it all done. Like, I guarantee your students can relate to the pressures you're feeling, even if the context is different. And that opens the floor to talk about the same things, to kind of talk about timeless truths behind it. Because a lot of times I hear from both sides, from students and adults, of like, it's different. Like teenagers saying, hey, you don't know what I'm going through because it's not the same as when you were in high school. But then adults might go on the other side of like, yeah, it is different. But also I was a teenager too. And it's like both sides of that argument are true. There is a common ground. Things might look different now. Like when we were in school, we didn't have the kind of technology in our pockets at all times that they do. But we also experienced bullying and social pressure and all of those things. So opening those conversations to find that common ground without trying to teach, without trying to constantly give advice, but just to listen, to understand, and to find whatever that similarity is.
You're saying we need to talk about our feelings.
We do need to talk about our feelings. And I am terrible at it. So I'm talking to myself right now too, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not easy. Certainly not with students. But man, it's like, everything you're saying, Shelby, I'm just like praying that parents of teens are just really soaking this in, because this is just good stuff and really eye-opening.
And to your point, Nate, I think these are hard conversations for us to have.
Yeah.
Like, imagine if we're uncomfortable talking about our feelings. Imagine the pressure our teenagers are feeling and how uncomfortable they are. Then how cool that moment could be with your kid when you're like, hey, we're both struggling with this. Let's figure it out together.
Yeah. Like they're literally just trying to figure out how to do that. And like, we're giving a great example when we're terrible at being vulnerable ourselves, So.
How about some more? Let's go to another one. What's another one that students shared was something they wish their parents knew?
Yeah. So this one was both encouraging and also kind of a gut check at the same time. It said, since they are older than us, we are told to look up to them, which causes us to take what they say a lot more serious. So when they say negative things about us or what we have done, it hurts more than if it were to come from someone our age.
Oof.
Yeah. It's like the first half of that was so encouraging. It's like, oh my gosh, you are respecting us. You are listening. You are watching. But then it's like, oh, am I worth listening to and watching? Especially in those moments where we do get emotional, when we have those emotional responses and we might say something we don't necessarily mean. We may not even remember we say it, but they're literally taking in every single word. Which frees up so much opportunity, though, is if they're listening to every single word, like how many opportunities do we have to encourage them?
as you're saying that, I'm thinking like, even in this podcast, did I say anything like disparaging against like teens and students? And hopefully it was all right. I know. I'm like, hopefully it was all taken as though myself being out of touch versus them being strange or weird. But I think that's part of it too, right? To your point you're saying, I think there's two sides of that. I think there's one that's the individual level, and there's two, culture as a whole. It's very easy to like say disparaging remarks about a younger generation. It's so classic. I know that we heard it from our older generations, and I know I've heard my peers speaking it about the younger generations. You know what I mean? I think it's like almost like it's something people love to do, or do it on impulse, and yet they're listening to that.
Which, from the parent side, is awesome though, because really what they said at the end of this, like how the things they say mean more than something their peers say. Like, parents, you are the greatest influence in their life. It might not feel like they're listening sometimes. It might feel like their friends have a bigger influence, but I mean, this is straight from a student. This isn't just me making this up. You are the single greatest influence in their life. And the things you say, what you do with them, good or bad, those things matter, which gives us such opportunity to help drown out some of those pressures they're feeling if we have those open, ongoing conversations with them.
I bet that's such an easily missed thing, for all of us. Like, I grew up an older brother. My brother is like quite a bit. Well, we're not so close in age. We're 3.5 years apart. I think that gap was just enough of a gap that I didn't really feel like I had influence, I was told often that I did, but never saw it. And that gap between being an adult versus a teenager feels like even more massive, and I think that is just such a great, it's weird. It's like encouragement, but a kind of a challenge too, isn't it? That we have that influence. And certainly for parents that they have that influence, but that's a real eye opener, right?
Especially because they might not be feeling that way, right? You might be hearing this and you're like, I have a hard time getting my student to listen to what I say. It's like, well, they're listening.
Exactly.
So, how about those for follow Jesus? Are there ones that are centered around things that, maybe our students that either follow Jesus or don't? I'm not sure what kind of responses you got on that. But from like a faith side of things.
Yeah. So the ones who did mention their faith in this, their kind of the overall trend was just wishing that adults knew that they don't necessarily know exactly how to follow Jesus yet. Kind of just this acknowledgement of not necessarily knowing what the next step is. They want to follow Jesus, but they don't have this step-by-step guide on how to do that. And one of them said, like, I wish they knew that nobody is on the same faith level as the other. Just this acknowledgement of they're on a journey of it. I thought that was super encouraging to me to hear how many of them kind of mentioned that, of realizing this isn't just something they arrived at. Like, they're willing to take the steps and ask the questions to explore it. And they're looking for guidance on how to do that.
Do you think that speaks to going back to like an expectation level where it's really easy to expect a certain level of faith that maybe hasn't gotten there yet? And if that makes sense, not levels of faith, but to use that language they say at a faith level.
Yeah, I think that's true. From my interactions with students, I think sometimes when they are most hesitant to talk about their faith, when they're most cautious about asking questions, is when they're kind of in the middle. When they completely don't believe any of this Jesus stuff, they're willing to ask all the questions and voice all their doubts and talk about it. And then when they're all in and they definitely follow Jesus, they'll talk about that and they'll be like, okay, what's next? I'm super excited. But then when they're kind of in the middle, when they're not really ready to commit either way. They're just kind of exploring it and trying to see, like, am I interested in this or not? It's when they seem to be more nervous and hesitant to ask questions. And John, I think you're probably right on that. It probably goes back to this pressure they're feeling to have everything figured out. So when they don't have it figured out, they're nervous to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. So Shelby, we got lots of parents of students probably listening, right? All in different places. What's just some advice that you would love to just give to all those parents?
Yeah, first, I think parents just know you're doing a good job. Because as much as we're talking about all the pressures and the expectations our teenagers are feeling all the time, I know you are too. Like, I think that's almost a timeless thing that happens at a lot of ages, a lot of stages of life. Like, parents, you're doing the best you can with what you have, and you're the best parent for your child. You know them better than anybody else. So you are exactly what they need. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but it's true.
Shelby, that is so good. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing this stuff and having those conversations with students so that, parents, adults, we could learn a little bit more and help us interact in a positive way to really help, bring hope to students.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Well, that was our conversation with Shelby. So Nate, let me send it over to you first. Is there anything right away that you're like, so these are some takeaways I'm hearing. These are some things that I was picking up. What do you think?
Yeah, I just think that Shelby had just like a lot of zingers in there, really. Like a lot of those lines she said just like really hit, whether you are a parent or teens or just an adult and just feel like it's hard to connect. Like some of that stuff is super encouraging, and to just hear how much we're on the same page with them in so many ways.
Yeah.
But man, what a great challenge too. Just knowing the influence that especially parents have with their students.
Were there any particular zingers that you were like, ooh, that's a good one?
I think like just the piece of like, you arrive to adulthood and you're like, oh, I still struggle with like being authentic and being vulnerable and stuff. And like, of course that's going to translate to students. And that particularly stuck out to me.
Yeah. And I think I just go back to like, because you listen to this and it's really easy to be like, ooh, this is a lot of things that, students wish their parents knew. And it's like, okay, what do I do with this information? And it just kept on seeming like the theme was, how can you have authentic, real conversations with your kids or with teenagers, with students, whoever, in a way that like validates, the things that they're going through and doesn't like belittle the things that they're going through. And also acknowledge that, hey, it's okay that your pressures are different than mine. It's okay that you're facing this pressure. Let's go through it together. Just the value of conversation and creating a space where those conversations can be safe.
Right. And like, there's no wasted time or investment there. And man, what a great line too. And she said, like, you are the best for your child, and like what that is for some parent that could be really struggling to connect. Like, that's not wasted time. And I thought it was a great little chat with Shelby.
Yeah, it was a great conversation with Shelby. If you're looking to have conversations with your teen, we have conversation guides that can help you like, hey, how do I ask these types of questions and these types of formulas or not formulas, but these types of topics that can be challenging. We have conversation guides on our website, which we'll link below. Other than that, if you think if there's some fellow parents that we think could really use this podcast, be sure to share this with them. And then as always, review, leave us a little review, tell us how we're doing. Hopefully it's a 5 stars, but we'll take whatever we can get. Right, Nate?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so make sure you follow and subscribe so you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.